the point where observation turned active. For most of history, observation was treated as harmless, a quiet act of watching the world unfold from a safe distance, with accompanying belief that simply looking, measuring, or recording could never meaningfully interfere with the thing being observed. That belief did not collapse because of carelessness or arrogance, but because science became extraordinarily good at seeing. So good that observation itself began to register as pressure, influence, and eventually participation rather than passive awareness. To understand why this point matters today, we need to return to a time when observation was slow, limited, and blunt, when measurement arrived long after events had already passed, leaving reality plenty of time to unfold on its own terms without reacting to being seen. In that era, data was retrospective. Knowledge lagged behind events. Observation followed reality, never leading it. The world behaved first, and only later did science attempt to describe what had already happened. But as tools grew more precise, faster, and more deeply embedded into living systems, that order began to reverse. Observation started arriving early, sometimes immediately, sometimes continuously, and with that shift, reality no longer had the luxury of ignoring it. At first, the effects were subtle enough to dismiss. Slight behavioral changes, minor deviations, systems adjusting around measurement in ways that felt incidental rather than structural. Each case had an explanation. Each explanation preserved the old assumption. Then the pattern became impossible to ignore. Systems behaved differently once they were observed repeatedly. Outcomes shifted when measurement intensified. Feedback loops formed between what was seen and how systems responded. Observation stopped being a mirror and started becoming a signal. This was the first reveal. Observation was no longer neutral. It was no longer something that happened after reality acted. It was now something reality reacted to. The act of watching it become part of the environment, shaping incentives, pathways, and behavior simply by existing. And once observation crossed that line, it stopped being a background activity. It became a force. The point where observation turned active was not marked by a single discovery or experiment, but by accumulation, by too many cases where seeing something clearly changed how it behaved afterward. And once that threshold was crossed, science could no longer pretend it was only looking. It was participating. As observation became continuous rather than occasional, its influence stopped being local and started spreading through entire systems, reshaping behavior not through intention, but through the quiet pressure being seen, measured, and evaluated at all times. This revealed a deeper transformation. Observation had become environmental. When systems know they are being observed, they do not wait to be corrected. They adjust preemptively. They optimize for visibility. They adapt to metrics before consequences arrive. What is measured begins to matter more than what is meaningful. This effect appeared across domains simultaneously. In biology, organisms alter behavior under constant monitoring. In economics, markets shifted in anticipation of reports. In social systems, behavior aligned with metrics long before any explicit reward or punishment occurred. Observation no longer followed behavior. Behavior began following observation. This created a feedback loop that intensified with precision. The more detailed the measurement, the stronger the adaptation. Systems learned what was being watched and reorganized themselves accordingly. What was not observed faded into irrelevance, not because it disappeared, but because it stopped influencing outcomes. The conflict sharpened when scientists realized that increasing observational power did not always increase understanding. In many cases, it reduced it. Systems optimized for what could be seen, not for what mattered. Surface-level performance improved, while deeper dynamics became harder to detect. This produced a dangerous inversion. Observation, meant to reveal truth, began obscuring it. The act of watching changed the signal. The presence of measurement altered behavior so thoroughly that the underlying system could no longer be observed in its natural state. What science captured was not reality as it was, but reality as it behaved under scrutiny. The emotional tension grew as this pattern became impossible to escape. Turning observation off was not an option. Modern systems relied on constant measurement to function at all. Visibility had become infrastructure. At this point, the problem was no longer how to observe better. It was how to understand systems that can no longer exist unobserved. Because once observation becomes continuous, reality never stops reacting. And what reacts constantly cannot be seen as it once was. The conflict reached its breaking point when scientists fully grasped that active observation did more than distort results in isolated experiments. It fundamentally altered the nature of the systems being studied, transforming them into entities that could no longer exist independently of attention, measurement, and response. Once observation became constant, systems stopped revealing their underlying dynamics and began performing for the metrics that defined them. Behavior shifted toward what was visible, reportable, and optimizable. The unseen, the slow, and the subtle were pushed aside, not because they ceased to matter, but because they no longer influenced outcomes within an environment saturated by observation. This realization carried an uncomfortable weight. Science was no longer studying natural behavior. It was studying adaptive behavior under surveillance. The emotional tension intensified as researchers recognized that many of their most advanced tools had crossed a point of no return. Turning observation off would destabilize the very systems those tools supported. Infrastructure relied on monitoring. Safety depended on metrics. Control demanded visibility. Observation had become indispensable. This created a paradox with no clean solution. The more closely systems were observed, the less their original behavior could be accessed. Yet removing observation entirely risked collapse. Reality had reorganized itself around being watched. The pattern repeated across domains. Financial systems reacted instantly to indicators. Social platforms evolved around engagement metrics. Biological systems altered rhythms under continuous tracking. Everywhere, behavior became performative, shaped by anticipation of measurement rather than intrinsic dynamics. This exposed the deepest conflict. Active observation changes not just outcomes, but incentives. When systems optimize for observation, they drift away from underlying health toward visible performance. Short-term signals dominate. Long-term resilience weakens. What cannot be easily measured is quietly sacrificed. The build-up reached its peak when scientists acknowledged that their role had fundamentally changed. They were no longer detached observers attempting to capture reality. They were participants shaping the conditions under which reality could still express itself. At this stage, understanding required restraint, not because observation was wrong, but because unlimited observation erased the very thing it sought to reveal. The point where observation turned active was not simply a technical threshold. It was a philosophical one. Because once watching becomes influence, the question shifts from how much we can see to how much we should. The climax arrived with a realization that could no longer be ignored or postponed. Observation had not merely become active, it had become formative. Once systems adapted continuously to being seen, measured, and evaluated, observation stopped revealing reality and started co-authoring it. What science encountered was no longer an untouched phenomenon, but a version of reality shaped by anticipation, optimization, and response to attention itself. This reframed the meaning of understanding. The goal was no longer to extract pure truth from an external world, because that world no longer existed in isolation. Reality had learned to behave under scrutiny. It expressed itself through feedback, performance, and adaptation, not through untouched dynamics waiting patiently to be recorded. The resolution demanded a quieter kind of maturity. Active observation does not require blindness, but restraint. It requires knowing when measurement clarifies and when it distorts, when visibility protects and when it reshapes incentives so deeply that truth recedes behind performance. Understanding becomes an act of balance rather than accumulation. This matters now because modern life depends on constant observation. Metrics guide institutions. Surveillance stabilizes systems. Monitoring promises safety, efficiency, and control. Yet every layer of observation changes the systems it watches, nudging them toward what is visible rather than what is sustainable. The point where observation turned active taught a difficult lesson. Seeing more does not always mean understanding more. Sometimes it means changing the thing we're trying to understand so completely that its original nature can no longer be reached. Reality under constant observation does not reveal itself freely. It adapts, and in that adaptation lies both the power and the danger of knowing too much, too continuously, and too automatically. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The point